August 18th, 1966. Torrential rain hammers a rubber plantation 5 kilometers from safety. 108 Australian soldiers are surrounded by 2,000 enemy troops. Their ammunition is almost gone. Above them, through the monsoon darkness, helicopter rotors slice the air. What happens next will become one of the most daring aviation missions in military history. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need to ask you something important. If you love untold stories of courage from the Vietnam War, stories that most history books skip over, then you need to subscribe to Vietnam War Records right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you the real accounts, the declassified missions, and the voices of those who were there. Don't miss another episode. Now, let's get into this story. The air above Long Tan rubber plantation was thick with violence and water. Rain fell so hard it turned the red clay soil into slippery mud that clung to boots and weapons. Visibility was measured in meters, not kilometers. The sound of automatic rifle fire, mixed with the thunder of artillery shells exploding among the neat rows of rubber trees. Somewhere in that chaos, Major Harry Smith crouched in the mud, surrounded by his men from Delta Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. They had walked into an ambush. What started as a routine patrol to search for Viet Cong water positions had turned into a desperate fight for survival. They were outnumbered at least 10-1, and they were running out of... To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what happened the day before. On August 17, 1968, the Australian base at Nui Dat had been hit by a surprise mortar and recoilless rifle attack just after midnight. The bombardment lasted 22 minutes. 24 Australian soldiers were wounded. Shell fragments tore through tents. Men scrambled for cover in the attack sent a clear message. The Viet Cong knew exactly where the Australians were, and they were willing to strike. When dawn came, the Australians sent out search parties. They found the mortar base plates. They found tracks leading away into the jungle, but they found no enemy. It seemed like the Viet Cong had melted away into the countryside, as they always did. The threat appeared to have passed. The next day, August 18th, the mood at Nui Dat was almost festive. Australian entertainers Cole Joy and Little Patty had arrived to put on a concert for the troops. Music echoed across the base. Soldiers gathered to watch the show, grateful for a break from the tension of the previous night. But not everyone got to attend. Delta Company, 6 RAAF was ordered out on patrol. Major Harry Smith and his 108 men left the base at 11 in the morning. They could hear the music fading behind them as they pushed through tall grass toward the Long Tan rubber plantation. Smith later recalled, they were not real happy at missing the concert. They expected to find nothing. The Viet Cong heavy weapons platoon, estimated at 30 to 40 men, was thought long gone. It was supposed to be a routine search operation. Walk into the plantation, look, nothing more. The 2 helicopters that would later save their lives were busy that morning doing something completely different. They were flying entertainers. Bell UHP 1B Iroquois helicopters, serial numbers A2 1020 and A2 1022, belonged to No. 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. They were based at Vung Tau, but that day they were on standby at Nui Dat. After the concert ended, the helicopters lifted Cole Joy and Little Patty off the ground and flew them back to Vung Tau. The pilots had no idea they would be flying back to Nui Dat in just a few hours, this time on a mission that would test every skill they possessed. Flight Lieutenants Cliff Dohle and Bruce Lane crewed one aircraft. Flight Lieutenants Frank Riley and Bob Grandin crewed the other. They were young men, most in their mid-20s. Dohle was the most experienced UH-2, 1B pilot in the RAAF. Riley was newer, still learning the complexities of combat flying. Grandin was 25 years old, married with a young son. None of them knew what was waiting for them in the skies above Long Tan. Delta Company entered the rubber plantation at 3 in the afternoon. The trees stood in neat rows, planted by French colonists decades earlier. The ground was relatively clear between the trunks, which made movement easier, but also made concealment difficult. Major Smith deployed his company in a 2-up formation, widely dispersed, alert, watching. The platoons moved carefully through the rubber trees. The rain had not yet started. At 3:40 in the afternoon, 11th Platoon, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, made first contact. A few scattered groups of enemy. Fleeting glimpses. Men in uniforms carrying AK-47 assault rifles. The penny did not drop immediately. These were not local guerrillas. These were main force soldiers, professional troops, and there were a lot more of them than anyone expected. Within minutes, the contacts increased rapidly. 11 platoon found itself almost surrounded. Heavy fire poured in from multiple directions. RPGs streaked through. Machine gun fire raked the Australian positions. Lieutenant Gordon Sharp stood to redirect artillery fire and was shot dead. Within 20 minutes, 1/3 of his platoon of 28 men were killed or wounded. The survivors pulled back, dragging their wounded with them, trying to rejoin the rest of the company. At 4:26 in the afternoon, Major Smith radioed back to Nui Dat, being mortared. Want all artillery possible. 5 minutes later, another message. Enemy on left flank. Could be serious. At 4:30, the monsoon broke. Rain came down in sheets, the kind of tropical downpour that turns day into night. The battlefield became a nightmare of mud and noise and death. The Australian soldiers went to ground, forming a defensive perimeter around company headquarters. They lay in the mud, water streaming over them, firing controlled bursts at enemy soldiers who seemed to come in endless waves. The Viet Cong launched massed human wave assaults. Lines of soldiers would suddenly rush forward. Australian and New Zealand artillery would burst right in the middle of them, scattering bodies. The survivors would dive for cover, wait, then get up and leap over their dead to resume the rush. They were inching forward all the time. The noise was overwhelming. Machine gun fire, rifle fire, bugle calls from the Viet Cong commanders directing their troops. The crash of artillery shells, the thunder of the storm, and underneath it all, the squelch of boots in mud and the screams of wounded men. What Delta Company did not know, what they could not have known, was that they had walked into the path of an entire enemy regiment. The 275th Viet Cong Regiment, approximately 1,400 to 1,500 men, had been moving toward Nui Dat for weeks. Australian Signals Intelligence had been tracking a radio set belonging to the regiment, watching it advance 1 kilometer per day. The last transmission had been detected on August 14th, near Nui Dat Hill feature 5,000 meters east of the base. Then the radio went silent. The Viet Cong Regiment had gone to ground, preparing for a major attack. They were reinforced by the D445 Battalion local force troops who knew every trail and stream in Phuoc Tu province. Together they numbered somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 men, and now, by sheer chance, Delta Company had stumbled into them. The Viet Cong commanders saw an opportunity. Here was an isolated Australian company, cut off from its base, caught in the open. If they could overrun it quickly, they would inflict a devastating blow on Australian morale. They committed more and more troops to the fight, but the Australians refused to break. Soldiers fell back on their training. They knew what they had to do. They knew their mates alongside them were doing the same. They fired as a team, providing covering fire for each other. When one wave of Viet Cong came forward, they would fire together, cutting down. Then they would shift position, reload, prepare for the next wave. The artillery support was crucial. New Zealand forward observer Captain Maury Stanley, along with bombardiers Willie Walker and Murray Broomhall from 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, coordinated fire from 4 batteries, 24 guns in total. They called down shells danger close, so close that shrapnel fell among the Australian positions. The gunners back at Nui Dat worked like machines, unpacking rounds, loading, firing, adjusting, over 100 rounds per minute at times. They knew but artillery alone could not win the battle. Delta Company was burning through ammunition at an alarming rate. By 5 in the afternoon, Major Smith sent another message. Enemy penetrating both flanks and to north and south. Then, at 5:02, the message that changed everything. Running short of ammo, required drop through trees. Back at Nui Dat, the commanders faced a terrible choice. Delta Company needed ammunition immediately. But how do you deliver ammunition to a company surrounded by enemy troops in torrential rain, with visibility almost zero as daylight fades? The only option was helicopters. But sending helicopters into that storm, into that fight, was asking pilots to fly a suicide mission. Group Captain Peter Raw was the Task Force Air Support Commander. He was the senior RAAF officer at Nui Dat. When the request for helicopter resupply came in, he hesitated. He understood what was being asked. Raw was not a helicopter pilot himself. He was a decorated fighter pilot from earlier wars, but he knew enough about aviation to understand that the conditions were beyond dangerous. The monsoon rain had reduced visibility to almost nothing. The helicopters would have to fly at treetop height to find the Australian position. They would be sitting targets for enemy ground fire. It was approaching 6 in the evening. In another hour, it would be completely dark. The odds of the helicopters making it back were low. RAAF asked the pilots themselves, "Can this be done?" Flight Lieutenant Bruce Lane, co-pilot on ATU 1020, was standing there. He was an experienced pilot. He looked at the weather. He looked at the map. He thought about the men on the ground. And he said, "Yes, it can be done. We can do it." Cliff Dohle, the pilot of ATU 1020, agreed. Dohle was the most experienced UHS 1B pilot in the RAAF. He had flown more combat missions than anyone else in the squadron. He knew the Iroquois inside and out. He knew what the aircraft could do and what it could not do. This mission was at the very edge of possible, but possible was all they needed. Frank Riley, piloting ATU 1022, also agreed. Riley was less experienced than Dohle, but he was determined. His co-pilot, Bob Grandin, later wrote about that moment in his memoir. Grandin believed it was a suicide mission. He was 25 years old. He had a wife and a young son back home. He did not think he would see them again, but he did not refuse. None of the pilots refused. If they did not fly, Delta Company would die. The two Iroquois helicopters lifted off from Nui Dat at approximately 5:45 in the evening. The rain hammered down on the windscreens. Visibility was so poor the pilots could barely see the ground. They flew at treetop height, sometimes only 9 or 10 meters above the rubber trees. Navigation was almost impossible. There were no GPS systems, no modern navigation aids. The pilots relied on maps, compasses, and their own sense of direction. They knew the general location of Delta Company, but finding the exact position in that storm was another matter entirely. The noise inside the helicopters was deafening. The rotors thumped. The rain drummed on the metal fuselage. The crew chiefs and door gunners hung on, watching for enemy fire, ready to return fire if needed. But they could barely see anything through the rain. Down below, in the long tan rubber plantation, Major Smith and his men waited. They were in desperate straits. Ammunition was critically low. Some soldiers were down to their last magazine. The company sergeant major, Warrant Officer Jack Kirby, known as Big Jack, moved among the men, taking stock. Kirby was a legend. A huge man, burly and strong, with an unshakable presence. He had been the backbone of the defense all afternoon. Under continuous enemy fire, Kirby had moved from position to position, distributing ammunition, organizing the collection of the wounded, encouraging the soldiers. At one point, when the Viet Cong tried to set up a heavy machine gun, only 50 meters from the company perimeter, Kirby moved out by himself and silenced the weapon by killing the crew. Now he was counting rounds. It was not good. If the ammunition did not arrive soon, they would be overrun. At 6 o'clock in the evening, they heard it. The deep thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors. It was faint at first, almost lost in the noise of the storm and the gunfire. Then it grew louder. The men looked up. Through the rain, through the gloom, they saw the helicopters, two flying impossibly low, just above the rubber trees. Smoke was popped to mark the position. A bright yellow smoke grenade, the signal the pilots needed. Cliff Dohle, in ATU 1020, saw the smoke. He maneuvered the Iroquois directly over the Australian position. Then he did something that required extraordinary skill and courage. He brought the helicopter into a hover, not a high hover, not a safe hover. He hovered at 10 meters just above the treetops, holding the aircraft steady in the wind and rain and turbulence. The crew chiefs pushed ammunition boxes wrapped in blankets out the cargo doors. The boxes fell through the rubber trees and landed in the Australian perimeter. The drop was precise, dead on target. Over the radio, a relieved voice shouted, "You bloody beaut, that was smack on." Frank Riley in ATO 1022 flew higher. His aircraft was tasked to establish radio contact, to locate the troops, to provide backup. He did not make the low-level drop that Dohle did. Later, there would be controversy about the awards. Riley received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Dohle, who flew lower and took greater risk, received the Distinguished Service Medal, a step below the DFC. Some believe Dohle should have received higher recognition, but in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the ammunition had arrived. The mission was. The helicopters turned and flew back to Nui Dat, vanishing into the storm. Behind them, on the ground, Big Jack Kirby got to work. Under enemy fire, he distributed the ammunition. Rounds for the machine guns, already preloaded in boxes, rifle grenades. The soldiers grabbed the rounds and loaded their weapons, and they were back in the fight. The Viet Cong did not understand what had just happened. They had been preparing for a final assault. They believed the Australians were out of ammunition, ready to collapse. But suddenly, fire erupted from the Australian perimeter again. Controlled, disciplined, deadly. The VC attack faltered. They regrouped, tried again, but the momentum had shifted. The artillery continued to pound them. The Australian soldiers continued to hold. And then, just before 7 in the evening, salvation arrived in the form of armored personnel carriers. A squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, commanded by 25-year-old Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, crashed through the Viet Cong lines. The M113 APCs, with their .50 caliber machine guns blazing, drove into the enemy rear. The Viet Cong, caught between the APCs and Delta Company, broke and ran. They withdrew under cover of darkness, dragging their dead and wounded with them. The battle was over. When the firing stopped, it was like someone had turned off a tap. One moment, the air was filled with gunfire and explosions. The next moment, silence. Only the rain remained, drumming on the ground, washing the blood from the leaves. The Australian soldiers sat in the mud, exhausted, shocked, alive. They had survived. That night, the helicopters came back. 7 Iroquois helicopters from 9 Squadron RAAF returned to Long Tan to evacuate the wounded and recover the dead. It was one of the most difficult flying operations of the entire war. The landing zone was about the size of a tennis court. There was no moonlight. The only lighting was 4 torches, positioned vertically in the corners of the landing area. The helicopters landed one at a time, in line astern, guided only by the small red tail light of the helicopter ahead. They flew at treetop height. It required incredible skill. One mistake, one gust of wind, and a helicopter could crash into the trees. But the pilots did it. They flew mission after mission, bringing out the wounded, bringing out the dead. By 12:50 in the morning of August 19th, all evacuations were complete. The next morning, a combined force of infantry and armored personnel carriers went back into the Long Tan rubber plantation. What they found was a scene of utter devastation. The rubber trees were shredded by gunfire and shrapnel. Shell craters dotted the ground, and everywhere there were bodies. The count eventually reached 245 enemy dead, buried where they lay in shallow graves. There were signs that many more had been removed during the night. Blood trails, drag marks, empty shell casings by the thousands. The Australians also found their own dead. The men of 11 Platoon were lying in their firing positions, still facing toward the enemy, their bodies washed clean by the overnight rain. 2 men previously reported missing were found alive, wounded but surviving the night on the battlefield. 3 enemy wounded were also found and treated. The cost to Delta Company was heavy. 18 Australians were killed in action. Another died from his wounds 9 days later. 24 were wounded but survived. 1/3 of the company was dead or wounded. 11 of the dead were national servicemen, conscripts. 7 were regular army soldiers. Their average age was 21 years. The youngest was 19. The oldest was 32. They came from towns and cities all across Australia. Farm boys and city kids. Some had been in Vietnam for only a few weeks. They died in a rubber plantation on the other side of the world, fighting an enemy that outnumbered them 10 to 1. But they held. They did not break. And a large part of the reason they held was because 4 RAF pilots flew into a monsoon storm and dropped ammunition when everyone said it could not be done. Why could the Viet Cong not stop those helicopters? The answer lies in a combination of factors, each of which played a role in the mission's success. First, the extreme low-level flight. Cliff Dohle flew at 9 to 10 meters above the treetops. At that altitude, in that visibility, the Viet Cong could barely track the helicopter. By the time they heard the rotors and looked up, the helicopter was already overhead, completing the drop. Most anti-aircraft weapons are ineffective at such close range. Machine guns struggle to acquire a fast-moving target that close. The helicopter was exposed for only a few minutes. That narrow window, combined with the confusion of battle and the torrential rain, meant the VC could not organize an effective response. Second, pilot skill. Cliff Dohle was not just any pilot. He was the most experienced UH-1B Iroquois pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force. He knew the aircraft intimately. He knew how much stress it could take, how much wind it could handle, how to hover taxi through tight spaces. That knowledge, built over hundreds of hours of flying, made the impossible possible. Bruce Lane, his co-pilot, was equally skilled. Together, they made decisions in real time, adjusting to conditions, communicating without words, functioning as a single unit. Frank Riley and Bob Grandin in the second helicopter provided backup and support, maintaining radio contact, ready to take over if anything went wrong. The level of coordination and skill required for this mission cannot be overstated. Third, the weather itself became an asset. As dangerous as the monsoon rain was for the pilots, it also provided cover. The Viet Cong could not see well in the storm. The rain reduced their visibility just as much as it reduced the pilots' visibility. The low cloud cover meant the VC could not hear the helicopters approaching until they were very close. Mud mist rising from the ground further obscured the helicopter's approach. By the time the VC realized what was happening, the ammunition drop was already complete. The weather that made the mission so dangerous also made it possible. Fourth, the element of surprise. The Viet Cong did not expect helicopters to operate in those conditions. They believed the storm would ground all aircraft. That assumption was reasonable. No sane pilot would fly in a monsoon at treetop height into an active firefight. But Dohle and Riley were not operating on the basis of what was reasonable. They were operating on the basis of what was necessary. That willingness to do the unreasonable gave them a crucial advantage. The VC were not prepared. They had not positioned anti-aircraft weapons to cover the airspace above the Australian position. They were focused on the ground battle, not the sky. When the helicopters appeared, it was too late to react effectively. Fifth, determination. The pilots understood that Delta Company would die without ammunition. They understood the risks. Bob Grandin later described the mission as a suicide flight. He believed he would not return, but he flew anyway. That level of commitment, that refusal to abandon men on the ground, drove the pilots to push beyond normal limits. They flew with precision and aggression, taking risks that would never be approved in peacetime. But this was not peacetime. This was war. And in war, sometimes the only way to save lives. Finally, artillery suppression played a role. During the ammunition drop, the artillery fire was briefly halted to avoid hitting the helicopters. But the preceding hours of artillery fire had suppressed many of the Viet Cong positions. The enemy was focused on surviving the artillery barrage and assaulting the Australian perimeter. They were not looking skyward. By the time they heard the helicopters, the drop was already happening. The coordination between the ground commander, the artillery, and the helicopter pilots was seamless. Major Smith called for the artillery to halt. Captain Maurice Stanley and his New Zealand gunners complied. The drop was made, the artillery resumed. It happened fast, professionally, with no wasted time. The impact of the helicopter resupply cannot be overstated. Without those ammunition boxes, Delta Company would have been overrun within. The Viet Cong were massing for a final assault. The Australians had almost no ammunition left. Some soldiers were down to a few rounds, others had none. The arrival of the ammunition, at that exact moment, changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Suddenly the Australians could fight again. They could hold their perimeter. They could wait for the relief force. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical ammunition. The soldiers knew they had not been abandoned. They knew the RAAF would fly through hell to support them. That knowledge, that assurance, gave them the strength to keep fighting. In the years after Long Tan, the story of the helicopter resupply became legendary, but it also sparked controversy. Why did Group Captain Peter Raw initially hesitate? Was it reasonable caution, or was it reluctance to support the army? The debate has never been fully resolved. Some army officers believed the RAAF was too cautious, too unwilling to take risks. They pointed to Raw's hesitation as evidence. Others argued that Raw did exactly what a responsible commander should do. He consulted his pilots. He assessed the risks. When the pilots said the mission was possible, he authorized it. Raw was not a helicopter pilot. He relied on the expertise of men like Dohle and Lane. That is not cowardice. That is good leadership. The awards controversy is similarly. Frank Riley received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Cliff Dohle received the Distinguished Service Medal. Many believe Dohle should have received the higher award. He was the pilot who made the low-level drop. He took the greater risk. Riley flew higher at what was considered a safe altitude. Why did Riley get the DFC and Dohle get the DSM? The answer may lie in the complex politics of military awards, or it may simply be a mistake, an oversight that was never corrected. In 2009, a Defense Honors and Awards Tribunal examined the issue. They looked at the evidence, the recommendations, the flight logs. Dohle died in later years, never having received the DFC that many believed he deserved. Bob Grandin, who flew as co-pilot on Riley's aircraft, received no immediate gallantry award at all. It was only decades later, when he published his memoir, that his role in the mission became widely known. Delta Company received the United States Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors the U.S. military can bestow on a foreign unit. 15 Commonwealth decorations were awarded to individual soldiers for their actions during the battle. In 2009, the Australian government finally conferred the Australian Unit Citation for gallantry on Delta Company 6th RAAF. Major Harry Smith received the Military Cross for his leadership during the battle. Warrant Officer Jack Kirby was recommended for the Military Medal. In 2016, another Defence Honours Tribunal examined whether Kirby should have received a higher award. The tribunal concluded that his actions were extraordinary, but the original awards were not changed. This is often the way with military honours. Years pass, memories fade, politics intervene. The men who deserved recognition do not always receive it, or they receive it too late, when they are too old to care or already gone. The Viet Cong also had their perspective on the battle. Initially, they considered Long Tan a victory. They had ambushed an isolated Australian company. They had inflicted significant casualties. Politically, it was a success, but militarily, it was a disaster. The 275th Regiment suffered heavy losses. Exact numbers remain disputed. The Australians counted 245 bodies on the battlefield and estimated hundreds more wounded or killed and removed. Vietnamese sources published after the war claimed only 47 killed and 100 wounded. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. In 2018, Australian researcher Ernie Chamberlain published a study documenting 190 names of 275th Regiment personnel killed at Long Tan. These names came from Vietnamese memorial records and post-war accounts. It is the closest anyone has come to an accurate count. What is undisputed is that the 275th Regiment was badly damaged. It withdrew from the area and took months to recover. The planned attack on Nui Dat was abandoned. The Australians had established dominance in Phuoc Tuy province, at least for a time. But the VC were not destroyed. They regrouped. They recruited new soldiers. They continued fighting for 9 more years, until North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon in April 1975 and the war ended. Long Tan was not a decisive battle. It did not change the course of the Vietnam War, but it did change the way the Australians were perceived. The enemy learned to respect Australian firepower, Australian discipline, Australian courage. The Viet Cong commanders told their troops to avoid the Australians if possible. Fight the Americans instead. The Australians were too dangerous. The role of the New Zealand gunners deserves special mention. 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery provided the direct fire support for Delta Company during the battle. They were the first battery called upon, and they responded magnificently. Captain Maurice Stanley, the forward observer with Delta Company, coordinated the fire with extraordinary precision. He called down shells danger close, adjusting fire in real time as the battle shifted. The New Zealand gunners back at Nui Dat worked without rest for over 3.5 hours, firing mission after mission, adjusting elevations and charges, maintaining a rate of fire that exhausted them physically but never wavered. The bond between the New Zealand artillery and the Australian infantry, forged in that crucible, lasted for decades. It was a true Anzac moment, Australians and New Zealanders fighting side by side, depending on each other, saving each other. The relief force led by Lieutenant Adrian Roberts also played a critical role. Roberts was 25 years old, commanding a troop of M113 armored personnel carriers. When the call came that Delta Company was in trouble, Roberts did not hesitate. He gathered his APCs, loaded infantry from Alpha Company, 6th RAAF, and drove toward the sound of the guns. The route was difficult. The APCs had to navigate around obstacles, through mud, across streams. They were fired upon by enemy troops, but Roberts kept going. When they finally broke through to Delta Company's position, just before 7 in the evening, the sight of those APCs was the most beautiful thing the Australian soldiers had ever seen. The .50 caliber machine guns on the APCs raked the Viet Cong positions. The enemy, caught between the APCs and the Australian infantry, broke and ran. Roberts received the Military Cross for his leadership. He went on to have a distinguished career, eventually reaching the rank of colonel. He died in December 2021 at the age of 82, honored and remembered. 9 Squadron RAAF continued to operate in Vietnam until December 1971. They flew thousands of missions, inserted and extracted infantry patrols, evacuated wounded, delivered supplies, provided fire support. 6 squadron members were killed on operations during the war. Many more were wounded. The first aircraft lost was a Tu-1018, which struck trees and burst into flames on October 18, 1966, just 2 months after Long Tan. The dangers the helicopter crews faced were constant: low-level flying, enemy ground fire, mechanical failures, weather. Each mission carried risk, but they flew anyway, day after day, mission after mission, supporting the soldiers on the ground. The bond between 9 Squadron and the infantry battalions they supported was unbreakable. Today, Long Tan is remembered as Australia's most famous battle of the Vietnam War. The Long Tan Cross, a memorial erected on the battlefield, stands as a reminder of what happened there on August 18, 1966. For many years, the cross stood alone in the rubber plantation, a simple wooden marker. Visitors from Australia would come, searching for the site, paying their respect. In later years, the Vietnamese government allowed the cross to be replaced with a more permanent memorial, but the site remains contested. The Vietnamese do not celebrate the battle. For them, it is a painful memory of a war they would rather forget. For Australians, it is sacred ground. August 18th became Vietnam Veterans Day in Australia, a day to remember all those who served in that long and divisive conflict. The story of the RAAF helicopter pilots at Long Tan is, at its core, a story about duty. Duty to mates. Duty to mission. Duty to something larger than oneself. Cliff Dohle, Frank Riley, Bruce Lane and Bob Grandin were not superheroes. They were ordinary men doing an extraordinary job under impossible conditions. They were scared. Grandin admitted he thought he was going to die, but they flew anyway. That is courage. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. They understood that Delta Company needed them. They understood that without ammunition, those men on the ground would be slaughtered. So they climbed into their helicopters, started the engines, lifted off into a monsoon storm, and flew toward the sound of gunfire. The Viet Cong could not stop them because courage, skill, and determination trumped numbers and firepower. The VC had the advantage of position, the advantage of numbers, but they did not have the advantage of training, coordination, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. The Australians, New Zealanders, and the RAAF helicopter crews demonstrated that afternoon what small, well-trained, highly motivated units can achieve against overwhelming odds. It is a lesson that military forces around the world study to this day. Long Tan is taught in staff colleges. The battle is analyzed, dissected, replayed. What went wrong? What can we learn? And always, the helicopter resupply mission stands out as a masterclass in courage under fire. As the years have passed, the veterans of Long Tan have aged. Major Harry Smith, who commanded Delta Company with such skill and determination, went on to become Lieutenant Colonel Harry Smith. He fought for decades to get proper recognition for his men, particularly for Jack Kirby, whom he believed deserved a Victoria Cross. Smith wrote books, gave interviews, testified before tribunals. He became the voice of Long Tan, making sure the story was not forgotten. He died in August 2023, at the age of 89, still fighting for his men even to the end. Jack Kirby died much earlier, in 1987, at the age of 58. He never received the Victoria Cross that Smith believed he deserved. Every soldier who was at Long Tan remembers Big Jack Kirby, moving through the mud and the gunfire, distributing ammunition, cracking jokes, keeping everyone steady. The helicopter pilots too are passing. Cliff Dohle died, his contribution recognized but perhaps not fully honored. Frank Riley lived into old age, still proud of what 9 Squadron accomplished. Bob Grandin published his memoir Answering the Call in 2019, finally telling his side of the story. In the book he reflects on the mission, on the fear, on the decision to fly. He writes about the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that lives depended on his actions. He writes about the nightmares that came later, the memories that never faded. But he also writes about the pride in having been part of something larger than himself. Pride in having served with men like Dohle and Riley and Lane, men who did not hesitate when the call came. The Long Tan battle site is now a tourist destination. Vietnamese tour guides take visitors through the rubber plantation, pointing out where the fighting happened, where the APCs broke through, where the helicopter drop occurred. The rubber trees are still there, replanted after the war, The ground is healed, but the memory remains. Australian veterans sometimes return, walking the ground one more time, remembering mates who did not come home. They stand at the Long Tan Cross, heads bowed, and for a moment they are 20 years old again, lying in the mud, listening to the rotors of a helicopter cutting through the storm, knowing that help is coming, knowing they are not alone. The lesson of Long Tan, and specifically the lesson of the helicopter resupply mission, is this. In war, the most important thing is not technology or firepower or numbers. The most important thing is people. People who are willing to do the hard thing, the dangerous thing, the necessary thing. Cliff Dohle and his crew could have said no. They could have pointed to the weather, to the enemy fire, to the impossibility of the mission. No one would have blamed them, but they said yes. And because they said yes, 108 Australian soldiers lived to see another day. 18 did not. But without that helicopter mission, all 108 might have died. That is the difference courage makes. That is why the Viet Cong could not stop the RAAF pilots at Long Tan, not because the pilots were invincible, but because they refused to be stopped. Before we close, I want to remind you about why this channel exists. Vietnam War Records is dedicated to bringing you the real stories from the Vietnam War, the battles that changed history, the soldiers who showed unbelievable courage, the moments that if you found this story valuable, if you learned something today, then I need you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this. Second, turn on the notification bell so YouTube tells you when we upload new content. And third, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with a veteran. Share it with a history buff. Share it with someone who appreciates real stories of real courage. This is history that deserves to be remembered. Help us spread it. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Did you know about the RAAF helicopter mission at Long Tan? Do you have family who served in Vietnam? Leave a comment below. Tell us your thoughts. Tell us your stories. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you want to dive deeper into Vietnam War history, check out the other videos on this channel. We have dozens of incredible stories waiting for you. Stories of Australian SAS operations, stories of American Special Forces, stories of Viet Cong tactics and North Vietnamese strategy. This is just the beginning. Thank you for watching Vietnam War Records. Until next time, remember the courage, honor the sacrifice, and never forget the lessons of history. I'll see you in the next one.